Hey guys, so today you're going to be watching kind of a couple short videos put together, and you're going to be taking some notes in a graphic organizer. So go ahead, go to the assignment here, the French and Indian War and Taxation Without Representation. So what you need to do is you're going to need to take notes in a chart like this, just a simple two-column chart. You can copy and paste it, which is pretty easy to do down here, or if you want, you can start a new chart here. So I'll show you guys how to just start a new chart. You can do 2 by 2, and you want it to say causes of the French and Indian War, and you want it to say examples of how the effects of the war and new taxes upset. Okay, so as we watch these videos, we're going to be thinking about what caused the French and Indian War. There's a few long-term causes and a few shorter-term causes, okay? And then between both videos, we're going to see examples of how the effects of the war and the new taxes that were really also a part of that started to upset colonists, and really what happens is pushes them towards revolution, okay? So what you can do, guys, is you can go ahead, click play here on the video, and take notes, bullet point notes down here. When you're done, make sure to go ahead and submit, okay?
If that's something you're into, check it out. Okay, now the French and Indian War. Now, if I was in class, the very first thing I would ask my students is to name the two sides of this war. And inevitably, someone would raise their hand and tell me that the French were fighting the Indians. And then I would smile and gently correct them by saying, "You're wrong." I'm kidding, I love my students. Anyway, this was not a conflict between the French and the Indians. It was a conflict between the British and the French. And the French allied themselves with several groups of American Indians. And to be fair, so did the British, but their alliances weren't that important for this conflict. So it's the French and the Indians versus the British. Okay, so with all that established, let me tell you what we'll be trying to accomplish in this video. Basically, we're just trying to explain the causes and effects of the French and Indian War, okay? Easy. So let's start with the causes. Now, the first thing you need to know is that the French and Indian War was actually a smaller conflict in the context of a much larger global conflict between the British and the French called the 7 Years' War. So the 7 Years' War was a worldwide conflict, and the French and Indian War was a small part of that conflict which occurred on the American soil. So the cause of this war is pretty simple. The British-American colonists were steadily encroaching on land in the Ohio River Valley that the French had laid claim to. And here's where I introduce you to a young and scrappy Virginian officer by the name of George Washington. Now, by 1753, he had been appointed lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia, and as such, Virginia's government sent Washington west to warn the French of encroaching on British holdings in the Ohio River Valley. The French commander whom Washington met rebuffed him. "Consider yourself rebuffed." And 6 months later, this same commander took control of a British post in Pennsylvania called Fort Duquesne, and so fresh from chopping down a cherry tree— don't write that down, that's not real. Washington, with help from his American Indian allies, led a surprise attack on the fort in 1754 and then gained it back. And then 2 months later, the French, salty about their own rebuff at the hands of the man whom they had rebuffed, led a much larger force against the fort and took it right back. Now, why is any of this important? Because this was the cause of the French and Indian War. Territorial disputes in the Ohio River Valley between the French and the British caused this war to begin in 1754. Now, even before Washington was defeated at Fort Duquesne, a Congress was meeting to try to figure out British colonial defense against the French and the Indians. It was known as the Albany Congress, or the Albany Convention, and here delegates from several British colonies met to discuss a more organized colonial response to frontier defense and trade and westward expansion. They also invited a delegation from the Iroquois Confederacy to join them with the hopes of allying with this powerful Indian association. But I guess they were more like a token presence because the delegates didn't even involve them in the conversation. Side note, you may be wondering why the American Indians were willing to ally themselves with either side at all. Like, weren't the European settlers taking over all their ancestral lands? Like, why in the world are they wanting to make friends with them? Well, for most of the Indian groups, they could see that the best chance of maintaining some modicum of control over their lands lay in the perpetual conflict between European powers. Like, as long as these two European nations were fighting each other, the American Indians had a chance to maintain some control. And what they feared most is that one of these European nations would gain control of North America. But I'm sure they don't have anything to worry about. Like, that's not gonna happen, right? Right? Anyway, it was at the Albany Congress that our boy Benjamin Franklin took the opportunity to introduce his Albany Plan of Union. And under this plan, the colonies would establish a Council of Representatives to decide on those matters I already mentioned, frontier defense and trade and westward expansion. Now, this plan was ultimately rejected, not least because the taxation it required to exist stunk in the nostrils of the delegates. But the reason why it was important is that it laid the foundation for the future Revolutionary Congress, on which more in another video. Now, back to the war. At first, the French kind of mopped the floor with the British, and it was going very badly for them. And then add to that, the 7 Years' War was expanding more and more into a global conflict, and as it did, the British implemented policies that ended up being very unpopular with their American colonists. First, the British cranked up the forced impressment of American men to join the ranks of the Royal Navy, and that's one point in the lasting colonial resentment category. Second, throughout the war, the British quartered troops in colonial homes, and if anyone resisted feeding and housing these soldiers at their own expense, they were threatened with violence. Look at that, another point in the lasting colonial resentment category. Now, as the war dragged on, eventually King George was getting a little twitchy about how much it was costing, and so he opened formal peace negotiations with the French. The war ended in 1763 with the signing of the Peace of Paris. Now, this treaty had massive results for the American colonists. First, Spain ceded Florida to the British. Second, the French were ousted from the North American continent, and the Spanish were given control over former French lands west of the Mississippi. Third, all the land east of the Mississippi River, which is to say the Ohio River Valley, was granted to the British. And now is where we start talking about the effects of the French and Indian War, and there were two main consequences I need to mention. First, because the land in the Ohio River Valley was now under British control, American colonists, hungry for more land, began to push westward. And as you can imagine, this migration intensified the conflicts with the Native Americans who lived there, and when news of this new land arrangement reached the Ottawa leader Pontiac, he led raids against the encroaching colonists in Detroit and other military forts in Virginia and Pennsylvania. And so, seeking to protect their colonists from more violence with the natives of the region, the British Parliament established the Proclamation Line of 1763, which forbade the colonists from migrating west across the Appalachian Mountains and taking land in the Ohio River Valley. But the colonists, in what will become a lasting theme in American history, were like, yeah, right, and went ahead and migrated west anyway, and their reasoning was that this war was fought on their soil at the cost of their blood, and therefore they were entitled to the spoils of that war. But when the British said nuh-uh and drew that proclamation line, that put another point in the lasting colonial resentment category. And the second major consequence of this war is that it was expensive. Like, as a result of fighting this war, the British national debt roughly doubled. Add to that, the cost of running the colonies increased something like five-fold, and so in order to pay for all of that, the British Parliament decided to raise the revenue by raising taxes on American colonies. Big mistake! And to see why that mistake added yet another point to the lasting colonial resentment score, you have to join me for the next video. All right, thanks for hanging out with me, and that's what you need to know about Unit.
Okay, guys, so make sure you've recorded some of the causes, and then you definitely have a few examples, okay? Now, on to the next one. This is just a couple minutes. You're going to get a lot more examples, but especially the new taxes that upset colonists and that ultimately drives them towards revolution.
Situation went on for a long time, but now that Britain was in serious need of some cash, they were like, salutary neglect? Shut it down. So in order to regain control of the colonies, British Prime Minister George Grenville implemented a three-pronged plan. The first part of the plan included stricter enforcement of the current laws like the Navigation Act, which, as I mentioned, colonists routinely avoided through smuggling. Second, Parliament decided to extend wartime provisions into peacetime, and here we got the Quartering Act of 1765. This law kept the British soldiers stationed in the colonies in order to enforce this British clampdown, and just for funsies, it also meant that the colonists were responsible for providing food and housing for these soldiers. And baby, the British are just getting started. Next came the Sugar Act, which imposed taxes on coffee and wine and various other luxury items, and it also enforced existing taxes on molasses. And then they imposed that most odious of taxes, the Stamp Act of 1765. This was a tax on all paper items produced in the colonies, like newspapers and playing cards and legal contracts and on and on. And then to further add to the turd salad that was the British imposition of new taxes, Parliament also passed the Currency Act, which prohibited colonial assemblies from printing their own paper currency. And that was a big deal because it effectively meant that while at the same time the British were demanding more tax revenue from the colonists, the supply of money was also being restricted. Like, okay, can you start to feel that restriction that they were feeling? It'd kind of be like if your parents had no rules about who you dated, and then all of a sudden they were like, yeah, you can't see him anymore. Whatever, Dad, it's not a phase. I love him. Like, all of a sudden, as the era of salutary neglect was passing away, the colonists were feeling altogether suffocated by these new demands and restrictions. And this rise in taxes was especially odious to the colonists because Americans were experiencing declining wages with a corresponding rise in unemployment. So take all of this together and it sparked a debate among the colonists whether it was just and right to impose taxes on the colonists who had precisely no representatives in Parliament. And this is where we get the famous phrase, no taxation without representation. Like somehow, somewhere, the colonists had gotten this crazy idea that they were involved in a social contract with their government and had natural rights that could not be violated. And where would they get such foolish ideas? The Enlightenment. Thanks, John Locke. Thanks, Rousseau. Thanks, Voltaire. Thanks, Kant. And honestly, if you asked me to name any more Enlightenment thinkers, I just can't. Anyways, the colonists started protesting all this taxation without representation. British officials argued right back, oh no, you don't understand. You all are represented, but it's virtual representation. To which the colonists responded, son, you're heading the right way for a virtual smack bottom. But to the British, this made perfect sense. The members of Parliament, even though none of them came from the colonies, represented not necessarily locations, but rather the interests of all British classes. But colonial leaders were all like, nah, and argued that the only people who could truly represent their interests were those who were from the colonies. So to be clear, there was a big discrepancy between how the British understood representation, which is to say by classes of people, and how Americans understood it, which is to say by location. So back in the
Okay, guys, so make sure, go ahead, fill out this chart. You can either copy and paste it or click this and insert one in your answer. Click submit. Thank you very much. I'll see you guys on Tuesday.